So we've been going through the giant despair. So we've already talked about the style going over into Bypath Meadow. They screwed up. They got caught. Now they got caught by the giant, and they're stuck. Now, what do you guys remember about the giant? What do you guys remember so far about the situation of our pilgrims and why they are where they're at? What are some of the highlights that you guys remember?
Well, they took a detour.
They took the detour. Because they were forced to? Of their own choice, right? And so did they realize their mistake?
Yeah.
Of course they did. And did they realize that there's consequences for their mistakes?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so now they're getting caught in giant despair. Now what are they chalking it up to?
They deserve it now.
They deserve it, right? Who's passed judgment upon them? Who's passed judgment upon them?
They did it themselves.
They did. Because what's the judgment that God has passed upon them ultimately? Not guilty, right? If they believe in Jesus, if they have come, if they have embraced the gospel, if they have trusted the Lord for salvation, what is the judgment for all believers? Not guilty. It doesn't mean you don't screw up. It doesn't mean that you're still in this already not yet state that we have here until God completely redeems us. But right now we're still stuck with a sinful nature that's in the process of being redeemed. And in that we see that God is just showing us more and more about himself, right? But in that moment, if we look at this, they've decided that they should just give up because God has judged them. They think that God has judged them. We've screwed up. We are past being saved, right? Does that make sense? So who's passing the judgment? Well, they are. And that in itself is sinful. Does that make sense? Why is it sinful?
Putting yourself over God. It's making your judgment superior to his.
Right. And when did that happen most famously in our Bibles? It's almost, but not quite at the beginning. Yeah. What was Eve's temptation? Did God really say that you couldn't eat of all this fruit? And who made the judgment call of what God really said? Eve did. Does that make sense? That's what happens. And the same thing's happening here. Now, to these guys' struggle, they deserve it to a degree because they put themselves in this position to begin with. Right, and that's the thing that's difficult. If everything was sunny and roses and everything else, and they're passing judgment, we'd say, "Come on, man, you got to believe in the gospel. You got to understand what Jesus said." Right? The struggle here is they screwed up. They're in a bad spot. They are in a dungeon. They've brought this upon themselves. This is a bad situation. There are negative consequences. This is not fun and happy. This is difficult. They have put themselves in a bad spot. So to a degree, it's much easier to see how God's judgment can be real when you are facing problems. If you screw up and you're in jail, if you screw up and your kids are a wreck, if you screw up in something else, it's easy to see, well, yeah, I guess maybe this is God's judgment. Maybe this is God giving me over. Maybe this is, and so on. And you start coming up with all those things to match your negative consequences, your negative situation to what God said would happen to people that do sinful things. Does that make sense? So it's not as simple as it may sound to just say, these guys should have realized that God loves them. True, but that's a lot harder to do when the world around you is kind of dark and dreary and difficult. Right? And so they're kind of getting this fed. Now they're in a dungeon, and the idea of a dungeon is, it's dark, dank, it stinks, it's humid, it's, you got the skeleton in the corner and everything, you've got the sound of the chains, all those kind of things are meant to bring you down. So you can see where they're at. Part of it is probably in their head of how bad this dungeon is, and part of it is probably their actual situation due to the consequences of their sin. Does that make sense? You're good. There's space on this side of the room too.
Let's have a quick, easy escape.
It's kind of funny. It's like if you look at, so over the years I've watch the congregation, there's always there's the people that love to sit in the front, and there's people that love to sit in the back, and there's always this gap in the middle. And so depending on where you're standing, you're like, wow, it was really full today. No. Look in the middle. Anyways, so they were stuck there in the dungeon. And the last thing we talked about last week, now here's the key, is when they lay there from Wednesday till Saturday night. Okay, that's our time frame. And now Bunyan's going to tell us what happened during that Wednesday to Friday night. Christian had double sorrow because he screwed up. And the giant comes in, he beats them on the ground. They're laying straight down on the ground, and they were left to sighs with nothing but sighs and bitter lamentations. So this and this is key too. Despair, as it's going at them, is not powerless, right? It's making their lives miserable. They are sad slobs, these two. They're just sitting in there, and they're beaten down. Every time they try to get up, the giant comes back in and beats them back down again. So, these guys are struggling. They're in pain. They're in misery. They're not just the American kind of guys that sit there and everything around them is perfect and they just are trying to find something wrong. There's actually something wrong. They are miserable, okay? And it's a real misery. We met diffidence. Remember what diffidence is? It's the lack of confidence. It's the opposite of confidence. It's the belief that everything is going to go downhill, that everything's bad, essentially, right? And she's the one calling the shots while despair is the action. Okay, she's the one back here doing stuff, and despair is just Mr. T, and diffidence is Hannibal, right? So he's the one making the plan. She's the one making the plans. He's the one carrying out the plans. That makes sense. Did anyone get my A-team reference?
I did.
Thank you. Good. Appreciate that. Right. So he's the one that comes in there and does stuff, and so he's the one beating them. He's the one doing whatever, advising them, and this is where we left off last week, advising them that they should take their own lives. Okay, and Christian is tempted. Why would Christian be tempted to take his own life?
Because he has no confidence that things are going to get better.
Right, and so why would I want to stick around for more of this kind of painful misery? Why take another beating when I should just end it here? Because ultimately, what's his thought? If I end it here, well, all I'm doing is just accelerating what's going to happen anyways. Because God's already against me. I've already lost all my mercy. I've already lost all that grace that I had. So why just have, if the end of the race is bad, why wait for the badness and just make it worse along the way? Just end it now. That's his thinking. Okay? It makes sense. Now, what did Hopeful bring up? Well, Hopeful kind of said, you know what, that's not good. And this is where we left off. What was their view of suicide? It was murder. You're murdering yourself, right? And no murderers or fornicators will ever inherit the kingdom of heaven. So therefore, if you murder, you're murdering everything. Now, think about that standpoint, though. What was the key to the standpoint? And this is why I like to favor it a little bit. The Puritans generally nailed things pretty well. Some things they blew, but this one, I feel like they probably have an element of accuracy. They're thinking of suicide from a godly standpoint. And they're saying it's murder because who gives life and who gives death? Well, that's God's call. He brings you into this world and he determines the moment that you're supposed to exit. And so for you to accelerate that of your own power is to commit murder. And I like it because it seems very God-centered in that view. Okay? It's his sovereignty, and your sinfulness is basically overtaking his sovereignty. Okay? Now remember, this is suicide. This is, I have no hope, so I'm going to end my life. This is not, I'm going to take a bullet to save someone else. It's not the soldier that jumps on a grenade to save his troops. That's suicide too, but that's not hopeless, I got nothing else to live for suicide. That's bravery, right? This is suicide that says, I got no hope. I'm going to end my life because I'm beyond God's grace. Does that make sense? That's the scenarios we're talking about. So Hopeful tells them, this is murder. You can't do this. Besides, what if there's an opportunity? What if the giant turns around? What if the giant slips and falls on his face and leaves the door open? What if he forgets to lock the door? Remember, he started thinking of these scenarios. And so Hopeful is being hopeful, but what was the problem with Hopeful's hopefulness?
He was hoping in chance or himself for anything but God's.
Right. There's still no power behind it. He's just hoping that things might turn around, that they might get lucky. Right? So they might get fortunate. All right. So that leaves us with Let's see. So Diphilus talks to the giant, says, "Are they done?" Nope. He desired them, they let them go. With that, he looked ugly upon them, and rushing to them, had doubtless made an end of them. But he fell into one of his fits, for sometimes in sunshiny weather he fell into fits, and lost for a time the use of his hand. Therefore he withdrew. Okay, so page 8. Then did the prisoners consult themselves whether it is best to take his counsel. Okay, so that's where we just talked about. So we are on page 10. Well, towards evening, the giant goes down into the dungeon again to see if his prisoners had taken his counsel. But when he came there, he found them alive. And truly alive was all, for now, for want of bread and water, and by reason of the wounds they received when he beat them, they could do little but breathe. Okay, so remember, this is an allegory for a spiritual condition. What is the idea of these Christians hanging in there, not quite dead, but barely alive? You almost want to throw in a Princess Bride reference in there, but they're barely alive because they've had no food and water, and they have all these wounds. What is the actual picture you would place if you had to put kind of bring this into real life?
Severe depression.
Severe depression. They're lacking food and water. What would that indicate? And it actually says bread and water, if you want to look at it that way.
Spiritually dry.
Spiritually dry, meaning what?
They haven't been partaking of the word or...
Good. So they're spiritually dry. They haven't been using the means of grace. They haven't been in the Word. They haven't been in prayer. What else?
Starving.
They're starving for
Both physical sustenance and spiritual sustenance.
probably. They probably haven't eaten, literally, because a lot of times it's something that happens. I'm a stress eater. I tend to eat more when I get stressed, but some people tend to eat less when they get depressed. And so they could be literally lacking food, lacking water, physically taking the beating of this depression, as well as spiritually taking the beating of this depression where they're not with God. And so when you're away from God because you don't think that He wants you, what are you basically creating? A self-fulfilling prophecy. God doesn't want me, so I'm going to keep drifting away. Well, see, God doesn't want me because I'm drifting away. I'm drifting because He doesn't want me. Well, He doesn't want me, so I'm going to keep drifting. See how that kind of starts to feed on itself? It's like a little feedback loop. And so what's the only way to break a feedback loop? Well, you got to have an external input. Sorry, that's a spoiler. But so they're struggling, and they're barely alive. But this is important. Are they alive? Which means what in our book? There's still hope, but keep going. If you're still alive, then what does that mean? Your faith is still there. There's still something there. It's faint, it's flickering, it's under wraps, it's whatever, but there's still a part of you that still trusts that God will redeem. You still trust that God will come and rescue. You still believe that your Redeemer lives, and you will still sing that song, even though you're struggling, even though you've made all kinds of stupid mistakes, even though you're sitting there thinking about suicide, there's still a part of you that says, my Redeemer lives. I will trust Him till the end. So these guys are still barely alive, and despair keeps coming in there thinking that this is it. And yet He still finds these guys barely hanging on by their fingernails, but still hanging on. But I say He found them alive, at which He fell into a grievous rage, and told them that seeing they had disobeyed His counsel, it would be worse with them than if they had never been born. And in this they greatly trembled, and I think Christian fell into a swoon. All right, so what did the giant do?
Got angry.
He got angry, and he threatened, and he yelled, and he made a lot of noise.
And he misquoted scripture.
Not quite. And he left. Okay. Let's keep that in mind. We're watching the giant. The giant's beaten them, but not killed them. He's threatened them. Then he got and fell into his fits. Here he threatens them again. You're starting to see a pattern. He can come this close, but no further, right? So, but it's noisy enough and it's scary enough that they cause them to tremble. It caused them to tremble, and they start again thinking, if Christian even fainted. He starts to think to himself, maybe we should do this, right? Maybe it's best if we just go ahead and take our own lives and put ourselves out of this misery before the giant comes and gets us. Now Christian again seemed to be doing it, but Hopeful made a second reply as follow it. Now, Hopeful again is going to be the guy that says, you need to stop thinking this way. But this time, let's look at his argument, because it's a little bit different. My brother, said he, rememberest thou not how valiant thou hast been heretofore? That's another way of saying, don't you remember what you fought so far? Don't you remember how you stood up against Apollyon, against all these other guys? Right? Apollyon could not crush thee, nor could all thou didst hear or see or feel in the shadow of the valley of the shadow of death. What hardship, terror, and amazement hast thou already gone through? And art thou now nothing but fear? Thou seest that I am in the dungeon with thee, a far weaker man by nature than thou art. Also this giant has wounded me as well as thee, and hath also cut off the bread and water from my mouth. And with thee I mourn without the light. But let us exercise a little more patience. Okay, so let's kind of look through this real quick. How valiant thou hast been before. Apollyon couldn't crush thee. You walked through the valley of the shadow, hardship, terror, amazement, in all the other things, including Vanity's Fair. Okay? What's he bringing all that up for?
He's giving him hope.
He's giving him hope. How?
But it's very scriptural, because look in the Psalms, when David is depressed, you have to go back to what the Lord has done. And the Lord, throughout the Old Testament, takes him back. Remember coming out of Egypt.
Yep.
And being released from
Good.
that slavery. And yet this I called mine, and therefore I have hope because of the Lord's.
Exactly. You see with David a lot. In fact, most of your New Old Testament is remembrance. The genealogies are all remembrance. The genealogies aren't just names. They're not even just specifically for census purposes. They're specifically to remember great acts that God has done in their midst. We remember that guy because this is what happened during that time. We remember this event, and that's exactly what David does in the Psalms. We see that also with Ecclesiastes. Remember this happened. You see this all through 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are all memories of what God has done for a purpose of building up the people of God. That's why it's in there. In our scientific age, we think he's just recounting history, and we like to see what happened to Saul. Nope. Everything in the Bible has a purpose. Not just a list, a purpose. All the genealogies have a purpose. They all talk about something. Chronicles and Kings are not the same, because Chronicles is actually talking about the priesthood. Kings is talking about kings. Duh. Right? That's the idea. There's a reason why all those things are remembered. There's a reason why all those things are recounted. It's so that they can tell a story about who God is, what Yahweh has done in the midst of his people. So in the same way here, Hopeful is recounting all the things that have happened to Christian and how Christian got through them. And what does he want Christian to get out of it? That you can overcome? That you should just pull yourself up by the bootstraps? That you should just toughen it up? Come on, look how tough you've been in the past. Why can't you be this tough now? Is that what he wants him to remember? What does he want him to get out of all those experiences?
Hopefully God's faithfulness.
God's faithfulness?
And bringing him through.
Mm-hmm. And?
That no matter how dark it was, there was always a way out.
Yeah. That God had never abandoned him. God was faithful through all those situations. And Christian, what did you have to do? Did you just roll over and close your eyes, and when you opened them, everything was past and done? Well, no. You had to get through these situations, but you never got through them alone. God's grace and his faithfulness walked with you through all those situations. And what's the implication then now? Is this really any different than what you faced before, fundamentally? That's the big difference, isn't it? Every time we get into these situations, even though we've had all these past experiences, what do we think about our current situation? This is the worst.
Final straw.
This is it. This is the last one. I can't do this again. I can't make it past this one. This one's far worse than that other one that I had. This one's much more challenging than that other one. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're wrong. It doesn't really matter. It's still just another trial. It's still just another momentary affliction for God to show his grace in your life, for him to get you through by his power and your work. it's still another opportunity for you to know who he is that much more. It's that much more of an opportunity to put himself on display in your life so you, as his subject, can come and adore the king at the throne that much more. And remember, it's momentary light afflictions. They are passing trials. Not difficult, but also not final. Okay? And this is what he's trying to say. You went through all these things. Does that not mean anything to you? Does that not resound in your mind in terms of what God's gotten you through? Have you given up everything because of where you're at right now? Yeah. Art thou now nothing but fear? Now look, he says, look at me. Now this is interesting, because remember what got him into this mess in the first place, at least for Hopeful, was trusting that Christian, I didn't want to argue with you because you were the older guy. You were the more mature Christian, so I just did whatever you said, remember? Now look what he says, the tables have flipped. Look at me, I'm weaker than you. And I mourn, and I've been beaten. But let us exercise a little more patience. Look at my example, okay? This is Hopeful now standing up and realizing when, even though he's young, even though he's less mature in the faith, even though he's been out, he knows he's right. He knows that he's got to be the example of faith now for this older believer. Does that make sense? It's kind of Paul and Timothy. Don't let them look down on you for your age. Be godly, be that example, and let them come to you. Same thing, Hopeful's realizing when it's necessary for him to take the lead. It's now necessary for him to pour out his life into Christian to keep Christian going. When all the while as Christian, it's always been the older one. Right. William Mason says, here is a blessing for a hopeful companion. Here is excellent counsel. Let vain professors say what they may against looking back to past experiences. It is most certainly good and right to do so, not to encourage present sloth and presumption, but to excite fresh confidence of hope in the Lord. All right, page 12. Now, night being come again, and the giant and his wife being in bed, she asked him concerning the prisoners, and if they had taken his counsel. To which he replied, they are sturdy rogues, and they choose rather to bear all hardship than to make away themselves. Now, that's awesome. So a rogue, does anyone know what a rogue is? Rogue One was what? Rebels. Yeah. So they were scoundrels. They were ones that worked outside the law. Robin Hood was a rogue, if you know the Robin Hood stories. But so these guys, according to the giant, are sturdy rogues. Okay, so first of all, for them, of course, it's like a backhanded compliment, right? For us, that's awesome as the readers. I'm making the assumption that we're all going for Christian and Hopeful in this one, right? Unless you're like one of the weirdos. But Christian and Hopeful are heroes, right? And so as they're going through this, they're sturdy rogues. What is that telling you coming from the giant? They won't give in. They keep fighting back. They keep standing when they're supposed to be falling, and then they're sturdy, which means there's an element of strength to these men, which is funny because what's happening? They're sitting there saying, should we just go ahead and do it? Should we just go ahead and cut our own throats? Should we just end this right now? And the giant's saying, these guys are too strong. These guys are too strong. Strength has a weird look, doesn't it, depending on where you're coming from. To the Christian hanging up in the dungeon, they think they're at the very end of all their strength, and yet to people watching, what they see is a guy that won't give up, who keeps clinging to this gospel by his fingernails. And they say he's sturdy rogues. So that's a great thing. Way to go, these guys. So they choose rather to bear all hardship than to make away themselves. Then said she, take them into the council yard tomorrow and show them the bones and skulls of those that have already dispatched, and make them believe, ere a week comes to an end, that thou wilt tear them in pieces as thou hast done their fellows before them. Now, we've got a new threat. Take them in the council yard, show them a bunch of bones, tell them this is what's already happened, and if you don't end yourself in a week, 7 days, you're going to tear them in pieces. Does that sound weird? Yeah. What are you waiting for? Weren't you supposed to have done that a long time ago? And now all of a sudden we're giving in fresh 7 days. It's kind of like, it's like the grace period when somebody really wants, the best is the parents, right? Go to Target. Yep,
Count to 10.
exactly. Go to Target during Christmas and take a walk around the kids' toy section if you haven't already done it. It'll drive you crazy. But you get the kids that say, I want that. And the parents are like, I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2. Okay, you better listen. You better listen. Are you listening to me? Okay, right now. Okay. 2, right? And it just keeps getting pushed off, and there's never really any completion. That's exactly where we're at with the giant. I'm going to tear you in pieces. I'm going to rush at you. You guys should just make an end of yourself. Now it's going to be a week. And then look what he says. So when the morning was come, the giant goes down with them and takes them into the castle yard and shows them as his wife had bidden him. Then she said, the pilgrims, then said he, these were pilgrims as you once, and they trespassed in my grounds as you have done. And when I thought fit, I tore them in pieces. So within 10 days, I will do so with you.
About a week, huh?
Another one. Another delay. Another delay. What are we starting to realize about the giant despair?
He has no authority to
He has no authority
kill them.
to kill them. What does he have authority to do?
Discourage.
Discourage, create doubt, threaten, beat them, make them very miserable. Right? It's a little bit like Job. You can do all these things, but you can't touch him. You can do all these things, but you can't kill him. God drew that line, and he's not allowed to go over it. And so now when these Christians are sitting there hanging there saying, maybe we should just end our lives before he does, now what do we realize that they're doing? Giving him way too much credit. He cannot do this. Despair cannot kill you. Depression by itself cannot kill you. Despair by itself will not make an end of you. It will make you incredibly miserable. It'll do a lot of things to you. But ultimately, all these bones in this castle yard are not those that despair killed, because he can't do it. What are these bones that he's showing them? Ones that have killed themselves. The giant is now taking credit for it, because he cannot kill anyone. He says he can, but he can't. So they've got to realize this, that there is hope, that this despair is escapable. The only ones that die at the hands of despair are the ones that take their own lives, which means ultimately there is a way of escape. They've got to realize that. Okay? So they lay there for all day on Saturday in a lamentable case as before. Now when night was come, and when Mrs. Diffidence and her husband the giant were got to bed, they began to renew their discourse with the prisoners, and withal the old giant wondered that he could neither by his blows nor his counsel bring them to an end. And with that his wife replied, I fear, said she, that they live in hope that some will come to relieve them, or that they have picklocks about them, by means of which they hope to escape. Okay? So she nailed it, right? They live in hope that somebody will come to escape, that somebody will come to help them escape, or that they have picklocks. That one's kind of funny. So they have they can pick locks, is basically what they're saying. That these guys have a trick up their sleeve. They got something on them that's going to help them get out of this. And what's funny is yes and yes. Okay? The answer is both in this case. So by means of which they hope to escape, thou sayest, now my dear, said the giant, I will therefore search them in the morning. All right.
Not now.
Not now. Always. So they have a trick up their sleeves. Well, on Saturday, about midnight, they began to pray and continued in prayer almost to the break of day. So what day are we on now? Sunday. Okay. Now, probably more puritanical, probably than our current age. What was Sunday? The Lord's Day, right? Sabbath was actually Saturday, right? But they treated it as the special day patterned after the Sabbath. It was the day that it was the Lord's Day. This was a day that was given to worship, learning, fellowship, communion, everything. They packed it all in. It was a full day for a lot of Puritan sects, right? So that the way they do things, it was a pretty serious day. You left it all behind. Very sabbatical, very Sabbatarian, in the sense that they would look down a little bit on work. Not to the degree of Pharisees, but they had a very high view of the Lord's Day, We tend to look at it as what's getting in the way of my morning football games. They looked at it as, here's my event for the day. So they would tend to look at, when he says Sunday, he's importing a lot of meaning into that culture that maybe we don't necessarily see. What he's saying is, they are entering into the day of worship. That might be a better way of looking at it. This is the day where they would surround themselves with the people of God. They would come to sing, they would come to worship, they would come to pray, they would come to learn. They were sitting in Sunday school, they were hearing, these guys would preach for 2 to 3 hours, some of them, right? In some places. I'm not sure if Bunyan did that, but that's the picture, okay, that I want you to get out of in your head. When we come into Sundays, it's not just coming to church here for an hour or two. They're talking about an event. Okay, this is surrounding yourself with the Word of God, and that's what's more important. Is that during Saturday or their in between time, they were without the Word. They were dry. They didn't have the means of grace. But as they come in on Sunday, now they're surrounded by the ministry of the Word, the ministry of fellowship. Now they're brought into prayer. Now someone's leading them. Now they're hearing, they're around fellow believers who will talk to them about the Word and encourage them, right? They'll see God put on display in the pulpit, in the songs, in the music, and everywhere else. Does that make sense? So now all of a sudden, as they come into Sunday, what are they seeing? Well, they're seeing the gospel. They're seeing the gospel portrayed on all sides. So they're finally able to start remembering the things that they've been forgetting the rest of the week. So what's important about that picture? Well, number one, the church obviously gets elevated that this is the place where you want to hear that. But what's important about these guys, in our day and age where we don't have necessarily a Sabbatarian view, where church is any day of the week, where Sunday mornings aren't necessarily the Lord's Day, what's important then? How do we apply this? Is this a lesson we just chuck because we're not Puritans and we don't believe in the Lord's Day to the same degree? Or is there something that we can get out of this as people here? What do we need to do to people that are depressed? How do we help them? How does it help these guys?
Yeah, surround them with fellowship.
Yep, fellowship. Don't let them isolate themselves.
Lead them to worship.
Lead them to worship by doing what? Pulling out the hymnals?
Maybe.
Potentially. What are you doing?
Reminding them of God.
Good.
And His goodness.
Yep.
Despite what they feel.
You're reminding them of His goodness. What else are you doing?
Reminding them of their dependence on God.
Yep. And how good He is. And what are you doing? You model the love of God to them. Now, of all those things, what do we do on Sunday mornings? Yes, all of those things. That is a church. That's exactly what should happen. Sunday mornings are nothing more than us coming with all of our failures and everything else to come and worship, to love the people of God, to come and portray the Lord in front of all these people, to come and bring Him to life in our own minds and in the minds of others around us. It is the duty of the teachers, of the preachers, of the singers to be able to elevate God before us, not because they have some special ways of doing it, just because that is their responsibility. But we each have a responsibility to each other to do the same thing. So can we take a lesson from this? Yeah, it's not about the church. It's about what we do as a people of God to the people of God. And church is a special expression of that, but it's not the only expression of that. Does that make sense? So as we deal with the downhearted and the depressed, what do we need to do? Bring them into the throne room. That could be through loving them directly. That could be through reminding them. It could be pulling out the hymnals and sing. It could be whatever means it is. Bring them to the Word. Bring them to the Lord. Bring them to the goodness of the cross. Remind them of the gospel. Because that's what brings it up here. Finally, they begin to pray. They haven't prayed all week. Now they begin to pray. And when they pray, all of a sudden, now it was a little before day, good Christian, as one half amazed, break out in a passionate speech. What a fool, quoth he, am I thus to lie in a stinking dungeon when I may as well walk at liberty? What did he just realize?
He's had the answer all along.
Yeah, the gospel has never changed. The problem is not with God, the gospel, the problem is with me. How could I have forgotten? And it wasn't until Sunday, it wasn't until he was surrounded by the people of God, it wasn't until he was ushered into the throne room that he finally remembered. When he was left to himself, he locked himself out of the throne room. When he's with the people of God, finally he sees the throne room. Finally he sees the cross again. I have a key in my bosom called promise, that will, I am persuaded, open any lock in Doubting Castle. That, said Hopeful, is good news, good brother. Okay, we'll stop there for a second. What, William Mason says, what, pray in the custody of giant despair in the midst of Doubting Castle? And when their own folly brought them thereto? Yes, mind this, ye pilgrims, ye are exhorted that men pray everywhere without doubting. We can be in no place but can God hear, in any circumstance but God is able to deliver us from, and be assured that when the spirit of prayer comes, deliverance is nigh at hand. So all of a sudden they start remembering words like Ephesians 3, that he is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that is within us. The grace of the Lord was exceedingly abundant. The promises of him are yes, and in him amen, to the glory of God through us. He will complete his good works. All these things are there to encourage us, to remind us that he has promised to complete it. They are exceedingly abundantly above. Okay? That doesn't mean full. That's overflowing. Like there's too much to be contained, right? And that's what he wants to remember. That's what he wants. That's why those verses are in there. So we can remember how much God really cares and how much he has committed himself to us. And so this key of promise, why is it so powerful? Why can it open any lock in this castle? Because it's a divine key. Because it's the key that has the power of God within it. Because it's the key that encompasses all that he is. It's all of his promises to do what he will with his infinite power in our lives. That's the key of promise. It is the promise when he said it is finished. That's a promise that it is completely finished. There is nothing left. Okay? That's the promise that we should get to. Bunyan said, "It is a sin to begin to despair before one sets his foot over the threshold of the hell gates. For them let them despair and despair not. But as for thee, thou hast no ground to do it. What, despair of bread in a land that is full of corn? Despair of mercy when God goes about by his ministers beseeching of sinners to be reconciled unto him? Thou scrupulous fool, where canst thou find that God was ever false to his promise, or that he ever deceived the soul that ventured upon him? He often calls upon sinners to trust him, though they walk in darkness, jumping down, and help thee to remember that he is pleased in the first place to offer mercy to the biggest sinners." So, Hopeful says, that is good news, good brother. Pluck it out of thy bosom and try. So what is Hopeful trying to get Christian to do at this point?
Stop talking about it.
Yeah, let's go, okay? It's even better if you actually use the key, okay? So, they tried it. Then Christian pulled it out of his bosom and began to try at the dungeon door, whose bolt, as he turned the key, gave back. And the door flew open with ease. And Christian and Hopeful both came out. Then he went to the outward door that leads into the castle yard, and with his key opened that door also. Awesome. It's just flying open, right? Everything's going now perfectly along the way. After that, he went on to the iron gate, for thou must be open too. But that lock went damnable hard, yet the key did open it. Okay. So first of all, the use of the term damnable hard, it brings up some interesting questions. Number one, it's cursing in some ways, right? And Bunyan was criticized. Why is he cursing? Why is he using such coarse speech? I don't think he's doing it like we do in our movies, okay? He's not just doing it for effect. I don't think he's doing it for any reason. But let's kind of look through this and see, because I think there's a good lesson here. After that, he went to the iron gate that must be open too. This is the last gate. This is the exit, okay? Now, if we're thinking about castles and castle architecture, what gate was generally the strongest?
The outermost.
The outermost gate. Why?
First line of defense.
It's the first line of defense. It was the way in. You didn't want people to come in. So you made it thick, you made it heavy, you made it hard, you made it very difficult to get into. Well, what's the problem here? It's also hard to get out. Okay, so this gate on the front door, if you really think about it, is one of the most heavily fortified, difficult to break gates. Does that make sense? So when Bunyan says that it was damnable hard, he's not trying to express a hyperbole. He's not using coarse language to try to exaggerate the need. What is he really using the word damnable to mean?
Adjective.
Huh?
Accurately describing the gate.
Exactly, right. Because the gate, if the gate doesn't open, then what happens?
Right, they're condemned.
They're condemned.
Left there.
They're stuck.
Same state.
They're damned. There's no escape from this castle, and they're going to die there. Does that make sense? So this castle, this damnable gate, is not just an expression, it's truth. If you don't get out of this castle, that's the end. They're done. Okay? So it was damnable hard. It is difficult to get all the way out of this dungeon. But the key did open it. Does that make sense? Even the most challenging gate, even the thing that it seems absolutely impossible, the key of promise can open in this despairing depression, world depression. So if you struggle with this, just remember the promise, the key of promise will open all gates. It is the answer to everything. Every time we get into these states, it is the gospel. It is remembering the goodness of God that will bring us through all this. And that's what Bunyan really wants us to see. We can't stay there. We have to get out. We can't be satisfied to just say, I'm just going to be depressed until I die, and then God will bring me up to heaven, and everything will be great. You can't do that. Use that key. Remember those promises. Then they thrust open the gate and make their escape with speed. But that gate, as it opened, made such a creaking that it awaked Giant Despair, who, hastily rising to pursue his prisoners, felt his limbs to fail, for his fits took him again, so that he could by no means go after them. So, as they opened the gate, were they just free and clear? Not entirely, right? All of a sudden, they started to feel the depression start to try to come again on them. But because of that promise, they were able to escape. Because of the sunshine of the gospel, it pulls back that depression. When we live in the glory and the grace of God, the light of the gospel pulls back the darkness of depression. So they went on and came to the king's highway, and so were safe because they went out of his jurisdiction. There's a long quote here from Bunyan. You can see into his mind. It's too long for us to read, so we're not going to. But there are a couple of decent quotes here. The George B. Cheever one is a really good one, on page 18. Alas, alas, how many ways there are of getting into this gloomy prison. Oh, if Christ be not always with the soul, or if at any time it go astray from him, or if its reliance be on anything whatever but his mercy, his blood, his grace, then is it near the gloom of this dungeon. Then may Giant Despair be heard walking in his grounds, and verily the echo of his footsteps oftentimes falls upon the soul before the grim form rises in the vision. And some who have once entered the castle have stayed there a great while, because they have tried many other means of escape than by the blood of Christ, because they have used picklocks and penances and stratagems and the help of friends outside the castle, but not the key of promise, or that not aright, but throwing themselves on the Savior alone for pardon, peace, and justification. A man who gets into difficulty through sin will never get out by self-righteousness, nor are past sins nor the burden of them to be ever removed by present morality. Nothing but faith, nothing but the precious blood of Christ can take away sin, can remove the stain of it, can deliver the soul from its condemnation. So he said much better than I did. But that's George B. Cheever. Now, he was actually a commentator on Pilgrim's Progress in the 1800s, if you're wondering where the name came from. Now, when they were gone over the stile, they began to contrive within themselves what they should do at that stile, to prevent those that should come after from falling into the hands of Giant Despair. So they consented to erect there a pillar, and to engrave upon the side thereof this sentence: Over this stile is the way to Doubting Castle, which is kept by Giant Despair, who despiseth the king of the celestial country, and seeks to destroy his holy pilgrims. Many, therefore, that followed after read what was written, and escaped the danger. This done, they sang as follows: Out of the way we went, and then we found what 'twas to tread upon forbidden ground. And let them that come after have a care, lest heedlessness makes them as we to fare, lest they for trespassing as prisoners are, whose castles Doubting, and whose names Despair. Yeah, that should rhyme at the end there. So they get back to the stile, they go back over. So now they're back where they started. Okay, if you think about the length of time, they went days in the castle, and ultimately, where did they end up? Well, back where they started. So technically, they've gone backwards. right? Here's where they should have been. After all these days, this is where they now are. So they've taken their consequences. But these are consequences they'll gladly accept, because where are they now? Back on the path. Back in the blessing. Back in right standing before God. They're back where they're supposed to be. They're back and they love it. Okay? But more than that, now what do?
They erect those warnings.
Right. So what do they want to do? They want to help others. So what does that require?
Humility.
Confession and humility. Why humility?
Because they're having to admit that they did go that way. They did suffer the consequences.
Right. Right. It takes a confession. It takes the willingness to say, yeah, I've tried that. That was bad. Right? And they're going to get some looks like, you actually decided to go over the stile. So the fence, the way that it's off the path, the fact that there's this weird stile over it, all those things didn't give you warning. All the things that you know you're not supposed to do, the one rule, the path is to stay on it, and you guys ignored that and went over the stile. And what do you have to say to that? Yeah, I was that guy. Yes, I was the one that ignored all those things and decided to do that. That takes an amazing amount of humility. And it takes an amazing amount, especially as parents. There are a lot of things that we will confess to our children, but there's a lot of things we won't, because they're really, really embarrassing to us. We kind of would prefer our children not know about it, right? There's a lot of things that we'd prefer not to say about our past lives, but we have to. Not forced, of course, but when the time comes, it's important to be able to just say, this is who I was. By the grace of God, this is who I am. And this is for better or for worse. Learn from my mistakes. Don't do them. I keep telling my kids, the reason we tell you things not to do things is because we want you to be able to stand on our shoulders and be that much further along than we were at your age. We want to launch you, not just let you out the door. We want you to be better than we were at that time. We want you to learn from our mistakes. And so that takes confession. That takes a humility. That takes a willingness to stand and put up a sign that says, don't go that way, I know. I was the idiot that found out. So don't be like me. Okay? And so it takes a lot of effort to be able to do this, and it also takes a lot of humility to do it. But they did it. And so they, as it says, look at the fruit of this was. And many, therefore, that followed after read what was written and escaped the danger. So all their struggles, all the pain they went through, all the stripes that they have on their back, all the painful memories, all the nights in the dungeon, they redeemed and they used for the benefit of others. And more importantly, that God used them for the benefit of other pilgrims. Okay? There's a brilliance to that. All their pain actually did come to some good, even for them and others. Okay? All right. So we'll stop there.